All right, so I put some of these slides together, and to be honest, there's too many, so I had to pare it down. So what I'm going to do, if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'll tweet a link to the bigger pitch, or if you don't want to follow me, I'll just hashtag PreMoney, and then you can look it up and find it that way. But I guess I have to confess I'm going through a little bit of a creative spurt. So the last one I had like this was a little over 10 years ago when I decided that I had to leave Austin, a city I still love, but come to Silicon Valley because I thought that the way startups were happening was about to be revolutionized, and I had to get as close to it as I could. But what I want to talk about now, so this was 10 years ago, the lean startup revolution. So it's hard to imagine, but in 2005, you couldn't really raise $1 million in Silicon Valley. You could either scare up a tiny amount of money, or you had to go straight to the $5 million Series A VC round. And what we started to see was a whole bunch of things coming together. Offshore labor, search engine marketing, universal broadband penetration, pay-as-you-go web services, and they started to revolutionize how startups could be created. And we began to coin a term, 500,000 is the new 5 million. And not only a lot of startups happened, but a lot of entrepreneurs started to adopt these techniques, and the capital markets followed. 2 books captured the zeitgeist, and I look at these people not just as friends, but as sort of brothers in arms back in those days. And so Eric Ries was a consultant at Floodgate before there was the term lean startup. We had actually invested in his company, InView, and the way I met Anne Muraco was I was introduced to her by Steve Blank, who she was teaching a class with at Stanford. And that was where a lot of these ideas of customer development and lean startups happened. And so it was fun to have a front row seat to see debates about what the words should be and what the frameworks should be. And then it was fun to see them translated in such a way that it influenced tens of thousands of founders. And so, terms like minimum viable product, customer development, product market fit went from new ideas to kind of the mainstream vernacular, and the number of startups exploded. And then not only did entrepreneurs up their game and create these startups and achieve product market fit more rapidly than ever before, but the capital markets followed. You had micro funds, but you also had accelerators like Y Combinator and 500 Startups. Okay, so now here's the downside. The downside of low barriers to entry is low barriers to entry. And so what's happened, in my view, with lean startups reminds me a little bit of what happened when the laser printer first came out. Do you remember, like, when the laser printer first came out, you'd get memos that had 20 different fonts by somebody who'd kind of gone crazy with their word processor and wanting to make their printouts look fancy. And what I see now is too many startups where people are just doing a startup rather than trying to create something fundamental and breakthrough. The other issue, though, is that in a world of tons of startups, it's just hard to break through the noise. Product market fit is still critical, but it's no longer enough. Okay, so the stuff that I've seen some really smart people work on are in 2 areas. One is in company design, and the other is in category design. And my feeling is that these areas are going to be important new frontiers of the next decade, the way lean startups and minimum viable products and product market fit work. So I'm just going to go through them briefly here, and then the longer slides will have kind of all the checklist items. The first notion that I like to emphasize is something that I call the value stack. And so, and the reason it's a stack is it's a hierarchy of powers. So at the bottom is proprietary power, which is the thing that lets you avoid competing with other folks. The next is product power, which is what the primary emphasis of Silicon Valley has been in the last 10 years. Product market fit, innovation, lean startups. Company power is something that I've seen missing in a lot of even the private unicorns. What I've seen, Ann and I have a term for it, we call it TNACs, traction not a company. And it's companies that took off real fast, but didn't design their company, didn't figure out what their culture was, didn't have a philosophy of how they wanted to manage, and therefore kind of got ahead of themselves. And it's very hard to retrofit a culture. If you get the company culture wrong the first 20 employees, it's very hard to go back. And then category power is the highest power. Fundamentally, to me, category power is what causes people to change how they spend their money. Starbucks created a new category in coffee because they convinced us that we should buy $4 coffee instead of 50-cent coffee. Steve Jobs, I would argue, his great success when he came back to Apple is he created 3 new categories: the portable music player, the smartphone, and then the tablet. So proprietary power is about avoiding the need to compete in the first place. I think that there are 2 fundamental sources of proprietary power. One is technology advantage, and that's usually leveraging the exponential power of Moore's law. More and more, I'm seeing that startups, if they're going to compete based on technology, have to get deeper and deeper in how defensible the technology is. And so I just have 2 examples here. A Yazdi company, Ann funded. I'm not smart enough to fund these because I'm not technical enough. But Ann funded a Yazdi. It was like 7 people at Stanford who invented a new kind of topological data analysis, and 4 of them ended up working at a Yazdi. And so we had no idea if we were going to have any customers for it, but we knew that our competitive risk would be low because there wouldn't be a lot of other people who could copy that. And then there's this other guy that she backed that makes tiny little microscopes. And so fluorescence microscopes are usually 2 feet tall, cost $250,000. And this guy's invented a microscope that's like as big as like a cap on one of these bottles, and you can plug it into a USB port of a computer. And 3 folks overnight in a garage aren't going to create that using AWS. And then the other kind of thing that I think is important is network effects. And I like to say that that's a proxy for Metcalfe's law. So I think that the most important thing at proprietary power that I think we can sometimes lose sight of is that I believe that Moore's law and Metcalfe's law are the fundamental animating forces of the tech industry. They are the things that give a startup its disruptive power, and creating a structural competitive advantage based on that is essential to any startup. I think that the idea that you can just go fast and hope to be the first mover is a myth, particularly in a world where people can iterate so rapidly and follow so quickly. I like to call it Jerry Garcia's law. So one time I saw Jerry Garcia interviewed, and people said, "Why did people think that Grateful Dead is the best band?" And he said, "I don't understand what you're talking about." And at the end of the interview, he said, I don't try to be the best, I try to be the only. And so to me, that's what proprietary power is all about. Product power is talked about a lot already in Silicon Valley. So I just wanted to add one thing to the mix here. I call it the WTF feature. And so in this world, in this day and age, it's no longer good enough to just be merely interesting or compelling. You got to have a feature that causes people to say, "Holy crap, that's awesome. I'm not going to do it any other way from now on." Like we invested in this company called Zimride, and they decided to pivot to this idea called Lyft. And first time I took a Lyft ride, I knew we were going to be successful, right? It was one of these things. And how many of you have taken Uber or Lyft? Okay, so like, how many of you think that taxis are better than Uber and Lyft? Okay, so like, the first time I took a Lyft ride, I was like, I'm never going to ride a taxi again unless I have no other option. That's what a WTF feature is. Okay, Tesla self-driving cars. How many people have tried that yet? Okay, so you're in the car, steering wheel shows up on the little dashboard thing. You double-click back the cruise control stalk. It goes boom, boom, and starts driving itself across the Golden Gate Bridge, right? Hands-free. After that, it just totally changes your point of view of what a car is. So that's the threshold in today's world. And even better if your WTF feature flows from your competitive advantage, because then you have something that delights people that nobody else can copy. Okay, company power. This is the thing that I think people need to pay more attention to in the early days. I'm gonna go through this kind of quickly because a lot of them are checklists. The first observation is if you have proprietary competitive advantage and a great product that delights people, you have to be an idiot not to make money doing that, right? Because you have something that a lot of people want that only you can deliver. But it does involve focusing on coming up with a scalable business model, but also scalable management systems. Probably many of you are sort of more on the developer side or technical, and a lot of us have heard the term technical debt before, which is when you do a set of things that you kind of, it's like the Fram filter commercial. You can pay me now or pay me later. And some of these technical debt problems, result in problems downstream. The same is true of management systems. And so the first notion that I like to describe to people is culture. Do you define it explicitly or do you just let it happen? Now, most companies would say we have a great culture, but when I ask them, what is your culture, they can't tell me. I say, can you just give me a one-page summary of what your culture is? Because obviously, if you have a great culture, every employee in your company knows what it is, right? And for that to happen, it has to be written down somewhere. But you'd be surprised. If I took a poll in this room of the startups, how many of you have written your culture down? I'd be surprised if it's more than 50%. In fact, I'd be surprised if it's more than 20%. And a lot of people say to me, well, that's obvious. I'm like, yeah, but a lot of startups don't do the obvious. And so Weebly's done a good job of this. They give every employee something called the Hitchhiker's Guide to Weebly. And it talks not only about their culture, but their business conduct guidelines. These are some other things that I think every startup should have a philosophy about. What gets covered in one-on-one meetings, what gets covered in team meetings, what's inappropriate to cover in team meetings. These are what I call the Bill Campbell principles of just how people treat each other in a company and communicate with each other and contribute to velocity, but also understanding. This is another one that has surprised me. A lot of companies, I'll ask, what is your compensation strategy? And they'll say, oh, well, we salary stock, we're competitive. And I'm like, no, what is your strategy? What is the role of salary in your company? How do you decide what it is and what it means? When you communicate to somebody you're recruiting, how do you help them understand that the way you treat salary might be different from how your competitors treat salary that they're interviewing for? Same with options, same with bonuses. And so why is this important? Apart from the fact that it's just important because it's the right thing, we're all getting into recruiting battles. And if you get into a recruiting battle and you turn it into an auction, it's just going to go to the highest bidder. But if you show people that you have a compensation strategy that's tied to the awesomeness that you're trying to create, you'll get the best people to convert to your cause because they'll understand that you're trying to build something, that what they're doing is more than just a job, that they're joining a movement. This is one of my favorites. So when we landed on the moon in 1969, first of all, how the hell did we do that? Like 1969, HP had not invented the pocket calculator yet, and we landed on the freaking moon and came back. And so people tried to study, like, how did that happen? How did they do that? And they found some teams on NASA were 1,000 times more productive than typical teams that you would expect. They had one example where they had to put an antenna on top of a mountain, and there were no roads to the bottom of the mountain. And somebody says, what are we going to do? We can't get this antenna to the mountain. And somebody said, well, we should tell our boss, that we're in trouble and that we need some help. And they said, oh, God, if we tell our boss, we'll never get it done. There's way too much red tape. So somebody goes, who has the biggest helicopter in the entire world? And they do some research, and they discover it's the U.S. Navy. So NASA calls up the U.S. Navy, and they say, we need to borrow your big helicopter. And the Navy says, screw you, NASA, right? It's like our helicopter. So the NASA guys say, here's the deal. JFK said we're going to land on the moon in 1969. If we don't get this antenna up on this mountain, we're going to fail. So the Navy says, how many do you need? So the Navy gives them these helicopters. They fly the antenna parts to the top of a mountain. They assemble the antenna on time. The NASA moon landing was 1,000 examples of that. And probably most of you have seen a situation in your career where you were on a team like that. What I learned from studying this is that hot teams don't happen by accident. Hot teams are about empowerment. They start by having a clear and awesome mission, which is why it's important to not just do a startup and to have a startup that you think has the potential to be great. When you want to land on the moon, you're willing to like extend some things and extend yourself. The second thing, though, is not only do people need to think the goal is super important, they need to think that you can make it happen. And in fact, it won't happen without you. It's not about performance reviews. It's not about whether you can say you had a reasonable excuse for not doing something. The team does it for each other. How does that translate into how to run a company? What I've discovered is that when you're running a software project in particular, probably hardware, you can tell the team it has to be by this date. You can tell the team it has to have these features, but you can't tell them both. Because if you do, you disempower them. If you do, when they encounter a hurdle that's unexpected, which they will multiple times, they'll say, there they go again, giving me these unrealistic targets. Those dumb manager people don't really know what has to happen to make this ship. But if you empower the team to figure out how it's going to achieve the goal by making one of the variables their variable, then when something goes wrong, they say, hey, management let us decide what's in the product. They said it has to ship by Christmas. It's not their fault. You know, we told them what we could deliver. Let's deliver it or fix it. So hot teams are all about empowerment. They're all about a philosophy of having teams that are extraordinarily productive, not just good teams, extraordinarily productive, and you know, that flows from a great mission. Okay, category power is the highest power. The category kings, being the category king is the goal. And the idea is to introduce the world to a new category of product or service and not just sell something to somebody. And the reason you want to do this is it ultimately changes how people spend money. I'm not going to have as much time to go into this as I'd like, but I would also like to suggest that category power is usually not born of disruption. I think that's often misunderstood in our industry. Elvis didn't want to disrupt jazz. He wanted to create rock and roll. And most of the great category designers come from a creative spark that's powerful and awesome. They're not trying to disrupt anything. They're trying to create something great. And the only disruption comes after the fact because the world's point of view changes. Category kings usually get 70 to 80% of the profit pool. This, to me, is kind of the new manifesto for founders. So we've been working with these folks. Ann has been teaching a class with Al Ramadan on category design. And these are kind of some brothers in arms that we've been working at with Stanford and some other places around some of these new frameworks around category and company design. I highly recommend it. I think these folks did a fantastic job. The authors are a colorful group of characters from Peterson, Chris Lockhead, Al Ramadan, and then Kevin Maney. To me, a seed round marries the first two layers of the value stack. A successful seed round checks those two boxes. We exit the seed round knowing we have a product that delights people that only we can deliver. Sorry for the typo. Company power is about creating the flywheel for blitz scaling. We want to get the culture right in our management systems, basic systems down, so that if we're successful, we can grow at great velocity without screwing up the company. Because we're going to have to be like ducks and know how to fly in formation without being told what to do because we're going so fast. And then growth rounds are about capturing the profit from emerging categories. So this is kind of my last thought, is that this is the PreMoney conference. All of us are participants in early stage, right? We are at the headwaters of the innovation ecosystem. And our ability to advance the state of the art in our thinking and how we act and how we create these companies and treat each other is going to make innovation happen better and faster and bring abundance to more people quicker. And so I guess that's my admonition to us all, is to up our game, to play bigger, not just do startups, but to kind of take it to the next level in the next 10 years like a lot of the folks in this room did in the last 10. So I've probably talked too much, so I'll stop now. Thanks.